page 32. The defendant's attempts to enlist the vice president to fraudulently alter the election results at the January 6 certification proceeding. Paragraph 86. As the January 6 congressional certification proceeding approached and other efforts to impair, obstruct, and defeat the federal government function failed, the defendant sought to enlist the vice president to use his ceremonial role at the certification to fraudulently alter the election results. The defendant did this first by using knowingly false claims of election fraud to convince the vice president to accept the defendant's fraudulent electors, reject legitimate electoral votes, or send legitimate electoral votes to state legislatures for review rather than count them. When that failed, the defendant attempted to use a crowd of supporters that he had gathered in Washington, D.C., to pressure the vice president to fraudulently alter the election results. Paragraph 87. On December 19, 2020, after cultivating widespread anger and resentment for weeks with his knowingly false claims of election fraud, the defendant urged his supporters to travel to Washington on the day of the certification proceeding, tweeting, "Big protest in D.C. on January 6th. Be there. Will be wild." Throughout late December, he repeatedly urged his supporters to come to Washington on January 6th. Paragraph 88. On December 23rd, the defendant retweeted a memo titled Operation Pence Card, which falsely asserted that the vice president could, among other things, unilaterally disqualify legitimate electors from 6 targeted states. Paragraph 89. On the same day, co-conspirator 2 circulated a 2-page memorandum outlining a plan for the vice president to unlawfully declare the defendant the certified winner of the presidential election. In the memorandum, co-conspirator 2 claimed that 7 states had transmitted 2 slates of electors and proposed that the vice president announce that because of the ongoing disputes in the 7 states, there are no electors that can be deemed validly appointed in those states. Next, co-conspirator 2 proposed steps that he acknowledged violated the ECA, page 33, advocating that, in the end, Pence gavels President Trump as re-elected. Just 2 months earlier, on October 11, co-conspirator 2 had taken the opposite position, writing that neither the Constitution nor the ECA provided the vice president discretion in the counting of electoral votes, or permitted him to make the determination on his own. Paragraph 90. On several private phone calls in late December and early January, the defendant repeated knowingly false claims of election fraud and directly pressured the vice president to use his ceremonial role at the certification proceeding on January 6th to fraudulently overturn the results of the election, and the vice president resisted, including A. On December 25, when the vice president called the defendant to wish him a Merry Christmas, the defendant quickly turned the conversation to January 6 and his request that the vice president reject electoral votes that day. The vice president pushed back, telling the defendant, as the vice president already had in previous conversations, "You know, I don't think I have the authority to change the outcome." Paragraph B. On December 29, as reflected in the Vice President's contemporaneous notes, the defendant falsely told the Vice President that the Justice Department was finding the major infractions. Paragraph C. On January 1, the defendant called the Vice President and berated him because he had learned that the Vice President had opposed the lawsuit seeking a judicial decision that, at the certification, the Vice President had the authority to reject or return votes to the states under the Constitution. The Vice President responded that he thought there was no constitutional basis for such authority and that it was improper. In response, the defendant told the Vice President, "You're too honest." Within hours of the conversation, the defendant reminded his supporters to meet in Washington before the certification proceeding, tweeting, "The big protest rally in Washington, D.C. will take place at 11 a.m. on January 6th. Local details to follow. Stop the steal." Paragraph D. On January 3, the defendant again told the Vice President that at the certification proceeding, the Vice President had the absolute right to reject electoral votes and the ability to overturn the election. The Vice President responded that he had no such authority and that a federal appeals court had rejected the lawsuit making that claim the previous day. Page 34. Paragraph 91. On January 3, Co-Conspirator 2 circulated a second memorandum that included a new plan under which, contrary to the ECA, the Vice President would send the elector slates to the state legislatures to determine which states to count. Paragraph 92. On January 4, the defendant held a meeting with Co-Conspirator 2, the Vice President, the Vice President's Chief of Staff, and the Vice President's counsel for the purpose of convincing the Vice President, based on the defendant's knowingly false claims of election fraud, that the Vice President should reject or send to the states Biden's legitimate electoral votes rather than count them. The defendant deliberately excluded his White House counsel from the meeting because the White House counsel previously had pushed back on the defendant's false claims of election fraud. Paragraph 93. During the meeting, as reflected in the Vice President's contemporaneous notes, the defendant made knowingly false claims of election fraud, including, bottom line, won every state by hundred thousands of votes, and we won every state, and asked regarding a claim his senior Justice Department officials previously had told him was false, including as recently as the night before, that about 205,000 votes more in Pennsylvania than voters. The defendant and co-defendant 2 then asked the Vice President to either unilaterally reject the legitimate electors from the 7 targeted states or send the question of which slate was legitimate to the targeted states' legislatures. When the Vice President challenged Co-Conspirator 2 on whether the proposal to return the question to the states was defensible, the Co-Conspirator 2 responded, "Well, nobody's tested it before." The Vice President then told the defendant, "Did you hear that? Even your own counsel is not saying I have the authority." The defendant responded, "That's okay. I prefer the other suggestion of the Vice President rejecting the electors unilaterally." Page 35, paragraph 94. Also on January 4, When co-conspirator 2 acknowledged to the defendant's senior advisor that no court would support his proposal, the senior advisor told co-conspirator 2, "You're going to cause riots in the streets." Co-conspirator 2 responded that there had previously been points in the nation's history where violence was necessary to protect the republic. After the conversation, the senior advisor notified the defendant that co-conspirator 2 had conceded that his plan was not going to work. Paragraph 95. On the morning of January 5, at the defendant's direction, the Vice President's Chief of Staff and the Vice President's counsel met again with co-conspirator 2. Co-conspirator 2 had advocated that the Vice President do what the defendant had said he preferred the day before: unilaterally reject electors from the targeted states. During this meeting, co-conspirator 2 privately acknowledged to the Vice President's counsel that he hoped to prevent judicial review of his proposal because he understood that it would be unanimously rejected by the Supreme Court. The Vice President's counsel expressed to co-conspirator 2 that following through with the proposal would result in a disastrous situation where the election might have to be decided in the streets. Paragraph 96. That same day, the defendant encouraged supporters to travel to Washington on January 6, and he set the false expectation that the Vice President had the authority to and might use his ceremonial role at the certification proceeding to reverse the election outcome in the defendant's favor, including issuing the following tweets. A. At 11:06 a.m., the Vice President has the power to reject fraudulently chosen electors. This was within 40 minutes of the defendant's earlier reminder, "See you in D.C." B. At 5:05 p.m., Washington is being inundated with people who don't want to see an election victory stolen. Our country has had enough. They won't take it anymore. We hear you and love you from the Oval Office. Page 36, continued from page 35. C. At 5:43 p.m., I will be speaking at the Save America rally tomorrow at the Ellipse at 11 a.m. Eastern. Arrive early. Doors open at 7 a.m. Eastern. Big crowds. Paragraph 97. Also, on January 5th, the defendant met alone with the Vice President. When the Vice President refused to agree to the defendant's request that he obstruct the certification, the defendant grew frustrated and told the Vice President that the defendant would have to publicly criticize him. Upon learning of this, the Vice President's Chief of Staff was concerned for the Vice President's safety and alerted the head of the Vice President's Secret Service detail. Paragraph 98. As crowds began to gather in Washington and were audible from the Oval Office, the defendant remarked to advisors that the crowd the following day on January 6 was going to be angry. Paragraph 99. That night, the defendant approved and caused the defendant's campaign to issue a public statement that the defendant knew from his meeting with the Vice President only hours earlier was false. The Vice President and I are in total agreement that the Vice President has the power to act. Paragraph 100. On January 6, starting in the early morning hours, the defendant again turned to knowingly false statements aimed at pressuring the vice president to fraudulently alter the election outcome, and raised publicly the false expectation that the vice president might do so. Paragraph A. At 1 a.m., the defendant issued a tweet that falsely claimed, if Vice President at Mike_Pence comes through for us, we will win the presidency. Many states want to decertify the mistake they made in certifying incorrect and even fraudulent numbers in a process not approved by their state legislatures, which it must be. Mike can send it back. Paragraph B. At 8:17 a.m., the defendant issued a tweet that falsely stated, states want to correct their votes, which they now know were based on irregularities and fraud, plus corrupt process never received legislative approval. All Mike Pence has to do is send them back to the states, and we win. Do it, Mike. This is a time for extreme courage. Paragraph 101. On the morning of January 6, an agent of the defendant contacted a United States senator to ask him to hand-deliver documents to the vice president. The agent then facilitated the receipt by the senator's staff of the fraudulent certificates signed by the defendant's fraudulent electors in Michigan and Wisconsin, which were believed not to have been delivered to the vice president or archivist by mail. When one of the senator's staffers contacted a staffer of the vice president by text message to arrange for delivery of what the senator's staffer had been told were alternate slates of electors for Michigan and Wisconsin, because archivists didn't receive them, the vice president's staffer rejected them. Paragraph 102. At 11:15 a.m., the defendant called the vice president and again pressured him to fraudulently reject or return Biden's legitimate electoral votes. The vice president again refused. Immediately after the call, the defendant decided to single out the vice president in public remarks he would make within the hour, reinserting language that he had personally drafted earlier that morning, falsely claiming that the vice president had authority to send electoral votes to the states, but that advisors had previously successfully advocated be removed. Paragraph 103. Earlier that morning, the defendant had selected co-conspirator 2 to join co-conspirator 1 in giving public remarks before his own. When they did so, based on knowingly false election fraud claims, co-conspirator 1 and co-conspirator 2 intensified pressure on the vice president to fraudulently obstruct the certification proceeding. A. Co-conspirator 1 told the crowd that the vice president could cast the ECA aside and unilaterally decide on the validity of these crooked ballots. He also lied when he claimed to have letters from 5 legislatures begging us to send elector slates to the legislature for review and called for trial by combat. Paragraph B. Co-conspirator 2 told the crowd, all we are demanding of Vice President Pence is this afternoon at 1 o'clock he let the legislators of the state look into this so we get the bottom of it and the American people know whether we have control of the direction of our government or not. We no longer live in a self-governing republic if we can't get the answers to this question. Paragraph 104. Next, beginning at 11:56 a.m., the defendant made multiple knowingly false statements integral to his criminal plan to defeat the federal government function, obstruct the certification, and interfere with others' rights to vote and have their voices counted. The defendant repeated false claims of election fraud, gave false hope that the vice president might change the election outcome, and directed the crowd in front of him to go to the Capitol as a means to obstruct the certification and pressure the vice president to fraudulently obstruct the certification. The defendant's knowingly false statements for these purposes include: A. The defendant falsely claimed that based on fraud, the vice president could alter the outcome of the election results, stating, "I hope Mike is going to do the right thing. I hope so. I hope so." Because if Mike Pence does the right thing, we win the election. All he has to do, this is from the number one, or certainly one of the top constitutional lawyers in our country. He has the absolute right to do it. We're supposed to protect our country, support our country, support our Constitution, and protect our Constitution. States want to re-vote. The states got defrauded. They were given false information. They voted on it. Now they want it rectified. They want it back. All Vice President Pence has to do is send it back to the states to recertify, and we become president, and you are the happiest people. B. After the defendant falsely stated that the Pennsylvania legislature wanted to recertify their votes, they want to recertify. The only way this can happen is if Mike Pence agrees to send it back. The crowd began to chant, "Send it back." Page 39. C. The defendant also said that regular rules no longer applied, stating, "And fraud breaks up everything, doesn't it? When you catch somebody in a fraud, you're allowed to go by different rules." D. Finally, after exhorting that we fight like hell, and if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore, the defendant directed the people in front of him to head to the Capitol, suggesting he was going with them, and told them to give members of Congress the kind of pride and boldness that they need to take back our country. Paragraph 105. During and after the defendant's remarks, thousands of people marched toward the Capitol. The defendant's exploitation of the violence and chaos at the Capitol. Paragraph 106. Shortly before 1 p.m., the Vice President issued a public statement explaining that his role as President of the Senate at the certification proceeding that was about to begin did not include unilateral authority to determine which electoral votes should be counted and which should not. Paragraph 107. Before the defendant had finished speaking, a crowd began to gather at the Capitol. Thereafter, a mass of people, including individuals who had traveled to Washington and to the Capitol at the defendant's direction, broke through the barriers cordoning off the Capitol grounds and advanced on the building, including by violently attacking law enforcement officers trying to secure it. Paragraph 108. The defendant, who had returned to the White House after concluding his remarks, watched events at the Capitol unfold on the television in the dining room next to the Oval Office. Paragraph 109. At 2:13 p.m., after more than an hour of steady, violent advancement, the crowd at the Capitol broke into the building. Paragraph 110. Upon receiving news that the individuals had breached the Capitol, the defendant's advisors told him that there was a riot there and that rioters had breached the building when advisors urged the defendant to issue a calming message aimed at the rioters. The defendant refused, instead repeatedly remarking that people at the Capitol were angry because the election had been stolen. Paragraph 111. At 2:24 p.m., after advisors had left the defendant alone in his dining room, the defendant issued a tweet intended to further delay and obstruct the certification. Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what should have been done to protect our country, our Constitution, giving states a chance to certify a corrected set of facts, not the fraudulent or inaccurate ones which they were asked to previously certify. USA demands the truth. Paragraph 112. 1 minute later, at 2:25 p.m., the United States Secret Service was forced to evacuate the Vice President to a secure location. Paragraph 113. At the Capitol, throughout the afternoon, members of the crowd chanted, "Hang Mike Pence! Hang Pence! Where is Pence? Bring him out! And traitor Pence!" Paragraph 114. The defendant repeatedly refused to approve a message directing rioters to leave the Capitol, as urged by his most senior advisors, including White House counsel, a deputy White House counsel, and the chief of staff, a deputy chief of staff, and a senior advisor. Instead, the defendant issued 2 tweets that did not ask rioters to leave the Capitol, but instead falsely suggested that the crowd at the Capitol was being peaceful, including A. At 2:38 p.m., please support our Capitol Police and law enforcement. They are truly on the side of our country. Stay peaceful. And B. At 3:13 p.m., I am asking for everyone at the U.S. Capitol to remain peaceful. No violence. Remember, we are the party of law and order. Respect the law and our great men and women in blue. Thank you. Paragraph 115. At 3:00 p.m., the defendant had a phone call from the minority leader of the United States House of Representatives. The defendant told the minority leader that the crowd at the Capitol was more upset about the election than the minority leader was. Paragraph 116. At 4:17 p.m., the defendant released a video message on Twitter that he had just taped in the White House Rose Garden. In it, the defendant repeated the knowingly false claim that we had an election that was stolen from us, and actually asked individuals to leave the Capitol, while telling them that they were very special and that we love you. Paragraph 117. After the 4:17 p.m. tweet, as the defendant joined others in the outer Oval Office to watch the attack on the Capitol on television, the defendant said, "See, This is what happens when they try to steal an election. These people are angry. These people are really angry about it. This is what happens. Paragraph 118. At 6:01 p.m., the defendant tweeted, "These are the things and events that happen when a sacred landslide election victory is so unceremoniously and viciously stripped away from great patriots who have been badly and unfairly treated for so long. Go home with love and in peace. Remember this day forever." Paragraph 119. On the evening of January 6, the defendant and co-conspirator 1 attempted to exploit the violence and chaos at the Capitol by calling lawmakers to convince them, based on knowingly false claims of election fraud, to delay the certification, including A. The defendant, through White House aides, attempted to reach 2 United States senators at 6 p.m. B. From 6:59 p.m. until 7:18 p.m., co-conspirator 1 placed calls to 5 United States senators and 1 United States representative. C. Co-conspirator 6 attempted to confirm phone numbers for 6 United States senators whom the defendant had directed co-conspirator 1 to call and attempt to enlist in further delaying certification. D. In one of the calls, co-conspirator 1 left a voicemail intended for a United States senator that said, "We need you, our Republican friends, to try to just slow it down so we can get these legislators to get more information to you. And know they're reconvening at 8 tonight, but the only strategy we can follow is to object to numerous states and raise issues so that we get ourselves into tomorrow, ideally until the end of tomorrow." Page 42. E. In another message intended for another United States senator, co-conspirator 1 repeated knowingly false allegations of election fraud, including that the vote counts certified by the states to Congress were incorrect, and that the governors who had certified knew they were incorrect, that illegal immigrants had voted in substantial numbers in Arizona, and that Georgia gave you a number in which 65,000 people who were underage voted. Co-conspirator 1 also claimed that the vice president's actions had been surprising and asked the senator to object to every state and kind of spread this out a little bit like a filibuster. Paragraph 120. At 7:01 p.m., while co-conspirator 1 was calling United States senators on behalf of the defendant, the White House counsel called the defendant to ask him to withdraw any objections and allow the certification. The defendant refused. Paragraph 121. The attack on the Capitol obstructed and delayed the certification for approximately 6 hours, until the Senate and House of Representatives came back into session separately at 8:06 p.m. and 9:02 p.m. respectively, and came together in a joint session at 11:35 p.m. Paragraph 122. At 11:44 p.m., co-conspirator 2 emailed the Vice President's counsel advocating that the Vice President violate the law and seek further delay of the certification. Co-conspirator 2 wrote, "I implore you to consider one more relatively minor violation of the ECA and adjourn for 10 days to allow the legislators to finish their investigations, as well as to follow a full forensic audit of the massive amount of illegal activity that has occurred here. Paragraph 123. At 3:41 a.m. on January 7, as President of the Senate, the Vice President announced the certified results of the 2020 presidential election in favor of Biden. Paragraph 124. The defendant and his co-conspirators committed one or more of the acts to affect the object of the conspiracy alleged above in paragraphs 13, 15 to 16, 18 to 22, 24, 26, 28, 30 to 33, 35, 37 to 39, 41, 43 to 44, 46, 50, 52, 54, 56, 57 to 64, 67, 71 to 75, 78 to 72, 84, 85, 87 to 97, 99 to 100, 102 to 104, 111, 117, 116, 118 to 119, and 122, in violation of Title 18 United States Code 371.